Thank you. Just a minute intervention, please. Again, learning from the experience of Rwanda, from the Rwandan Unity and Reconciliation Commission, Dr. Jean-Baptiste Habyarimana, a brief comment from you in something that's not been said, please. Don't repeat what's already been said, to your fellow delegates here. What would you want to share from the Rwandan experience?
Well, thank you, Zena. I'm not Habyarimana, I'm Bishop John. I'm the president of the commission. I think Rwanda still stands to own a unique situation from the crash of caused by the genocide. And actually, long before the genocide, that built up to the genocide, Rwanda therefore had to work very hard to rediscover, to work hard to see who are we in the circumstances and what do we need to do to be a nation again and a people again, and also to be able to reclaim our dignity as a people from the crash, and also be able to take responsibility to design our destiny. It's an imperative calling and a commitment that the people of Rwanda had to be united, to be reconciled, painfully as it is in the stands. But in order to do that, we had to search into our history and see the made-up of the destruction from a people who speak one language, have one culture, belong to one country, who got united naturally into the making and eventually ended up with destruction. So that became the source of the revival of the unity and reconciliation of Rwanda. And all efforts invested into it has resulted into the result. The unity and reconciliation is not just a luxury. It's a source of energy. It's a source of power to develop and to sustain the development that is taking place. And you mentioned the values. The Unity and Reconciliation Commission, which is constitutional by the people of Rwanda, has not only restored our values through education. We have the training of the population to revive our traditional values, and not only values, but engage the values for the development and the dignity of the people. And that is actually resourced by the development and efforts to sustain ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Jean-Baptiste Habyarimana, I think you are here, but perhaps you don't wish to comment. Can I just very briefly now, 30 seconds each person, anybody want to contribute from the floor? Again, sharing Rwandan experience. Yes, introduce yourself, please. And really, really short. I'm just going to have to, if I had a button here to press your microphone on and off, I would. But go on.
Thank you.
If you introduce yourself.
I'm Dr. Matthias, State Minister for Primary and Secondary Education. There was a question on how the education system in Rwanda is, let's say, focusing on values and how we build our state. First of all, we have to recognize that ignorance is a source of divisionism. And an author said, tell me what to teach to your children, and I will tell you who you are. So our country, Rwanda, is focusing on a number of policies, programs, and curricula. Let's say targeting knowledge per se, but with our net enrollment of 96%, and for the net enrollment in our schools, we have to think what we have to do to build our state. We have to target, we have to focus on our peace building and our stability of the nation. So a number of programs, let's say, focusing on patriotism, civic education, leadership development schools, what we call in our traditional language, itorero. We look at this element to inculcate positive values to our nation, to our children. We can't say that you build your state. You are looking at its stability. you are focusing on peace building without job creation. Saying that job creation is the key, it means that we have to look at skills development. We have to look at entrepreneurship in our schools. So this government is looking at this, and we are focusing on these key components.
Thank you.
It has been decided, and it is the motto of this country. Our president is committed. We have a strong leadership, and we have to look at
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you.
Deputy Minister, that's a very, very vital contribution. Thank you. Leading on from my discussion on values. Good citizenship, very important to promote in the classroom. Yes, a lady here briefly, and then another hand there if you introduce yourself very briefly.
Thank you to the panelists and to this gathering. I'm the Minister of Health, Dr. Binagwaho, and I want to complete you, sir, because there's something you cannot see when you go only in a few sectors. We manage, the basis of all our actions are equity. That means what you see in that sector, we need to recover, to see it in all the sector, because this country was divided not only based on ethnicity, but also on region. North, South, etc. So that means we have got the DHS study, Demographic and Health Survey, and what has pleased us as government is that the difference of access to care and delivery that you talk about between rural and area and urban became so little, and that is the measurement of our success. And when you say that women are as the deaths of women have drastically diminished, we came from 8 women that were dying a day to less than 1. And in my report, I have every day the name of the woman who died, if one died, the place she lived, and why. And we go there and ask why. What could be done to avoid that? We have 35% of all our pregnant women who have 4 antenatal clinics now, and 70% of them deliver in a health facility. 90% attend antenatal clinics, but 35% for antenatal clinic. So this is something that is very important when you build peace and security, to build it on equity, on geographic equity, gender equity, age equity. Don't forget the children, they never talk. So this is something that have to be a pillar of any action.
And Minister, when Professor Frederick Goloba talked about the joined-up thinking in government, as Health Minister, just a brief comment on that, because we talked about the social determinants of health and the need for everybody working together. Do you get the cooperation you want from your fellow cabinet members?
Absolutely. This government, I don't work as a Minister of Health, you know. All my success belongs to Minister of Local Government, to all my colleagues, to the parliamentarian, because they go and spread the word and help our program. My role is just to think about what can be improved and put in the discussion all the people that can help me. So we work as cluster. This government works in 3 clusters. We have the governance cluster, the economic cluster, and the social cluster. And in the social cluster, I co-chair with my colleague from education. We have Minister of Youth, Minister of Gender, Minister in charge of employment, Minister in charge of gender. And together, when we have a problem, we meet together and we discuss. But more than that, we have the permanent secretary that meeting on regular basis. We have the technician in the health sector and all our sectors that meet. We meet around youth employment. It is my business. You know, I'm sharing the committee that do the work for my colleague. But my colleague meet on my problem on malnutrition, my problem on family planning. And that's how we came from 3 in 2000 family planning uptake to more than 45. Mm-hmm. We cannot do that alone. We have a government that has to work as one under the leadership of the man on my left, who is the Prime Minister. We report to him on success. And if education has a problem, I'm chairing that committee, I am answerable to that.
Thank you. That's very important. And I think we had that overview yesterday about the avoidance of every department working in their own silos, and your figures speak for themselves. Yes, is that Moses from South Sudan? Yes, some comments from you. Briefly, Moses.
Very brief. I just want to share the issue of peace and unity. It's an example in South Sudan that before this comprehensive peace agreement signed in 2005, there was a division in the movement in 91. That was a very serious division, and it cost a lot of lives. But in 91 there was a division that caused a lot of life. But the peace agreement could not be, the comprehensive peace agreement could not be possible without coming back as one South Sudan to fight for the liberation of South Sudan. So that was achieved in 2005, and we couldn't continue with the agreement. It was not enough because there were a lot of armed groups which were fighting the SPLA. We were recruited from Khartoum. What we did, what the government did, and the leadership of His Excellency the President made a point that all those armed groups have to be brought under one banner. So we managed to get all the armed groups into the SPLA, and then when we were also working when the referendum came, it didn't come as a lot of work had also to be done. That the political parties said and agreed that we are going for the referendum as united people, and that's why we managed to get 98.883%, which is very high. The other thing is that the reason why we are participating in the international dialogue as South Sudanese, simply because we know that we have to learn from others, and we will continue to learn from others. Like when we come to Rwanda, like this one, it is the reason for us to come and learn from Rwanda how they have been going on with their unity and peace. In terms of women involvement, we in the constitution, in the interim constitution after peace agreement, we have 25% of women involvement in the political arena in the whole country. That is because simply why it is 25%. Somebody will say that is a very low figure, but mind you, South Sudan, the literacy rate in South Sudan is very low, the lowest in the world. In fact, it is 27% of people, South Sudanese, are literate, those who can read and write. So those are some of the things I wanted to
Thank you.
Inform the...
Thank you, Moses. And I think my point originally to Bella Bird about South Sudan was about the fact that once you gained your independence, one could think that perhaps you no longer feel that there's a need to promote a culture of peace and unity amongst yourselves in South Sudan. And that was the point I was making there, that everybody wishes to encourage that culture of peace and unity within the south of Sudan itself. But thank you very much indeed for your comments. We're going to break for coffee just very, very briefly. Bella Bird, your concluding remarks just for a minute, incorporating some of the points that we've heard from the floor, and then the same to you as well, Professor Frederick Goloba.
Thank you, Zainab. Just 3 quick points. That was a fantastically rich discussion, and I've been privileged to be part of it. I just wanted to pick up on 3 things. Firstly, on the point raised by the Vice president of Timor-Leste, about people's participation, and that political parties is only one mechanism. And I think that's something that comes through again and again in the work in the experience of fragile and conflict-affected states, that finding a way to maximise people's participation, whether it's through a national dialogue, whether it's through community-based programs, where we know the evidence shows us a critical factor to any community-based initiative is the way in which people's participation is designed as appropriate to the context. So just one point to note there. The second is the one on violence against women. And I think two very passionate interventions by ministers from Côte d'Ivoire and CAR. And I think that this is an issue which the World Development Report wasn't able to say much on, because there's very little data on the nature of the problem, though we know it is widespread and it is tragic and is having an enormous impact on communities across Africa and beyond. And I would just really say a plea, anyone here who's involved in gathering data, doing research, we need to build up the data, our understanding and our analysis of violence against women, if we're going to have much more progressive work to tackle it. The cross-country learning is critical as part of that. Thirdly, I wanted to say a thank you to our Rwandan hosts for taking us to the Genocide Museum yesterday, which I personally found deeply moving. And I think the strategic importance of the way that you took your guests to have that experience of, and sharing the experience of what you've been through as a nation is such an important part of building your nation and building the understanding of your friends and international partners of the road that you've travelled and where you're going. And I just wanted to say a thank you to you. I think there's a lesson that other countries could perhaps take away from Rwanda. We often hear that our international partners, like the World Bank, like others, do not relate to the experience of the countries coming out of conflict, that we bring our own frameworks and models. It's true, we do, and we don't necessarily understand, and we can throw labels like kangaroo courts at what turn out to be a really effective local justice mechanisms, and that importance of building the understanding between the countries that are moving out of fragility and the partners that want to help them, I think is a big takeaway for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Bella Bird. Frederick Goloba.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would like to say here is that the program within the context of which we have been conducting our research set out to try and identify non-conventional ways in which countries like Rwanda deliver goods to poor people. And I think that it's no exaggeration to say that Rwanda seems to have thrived on defying convention. And I think that that's one big lesson that I hope that the delegates to this meeting will take away with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. And just anything you wish to comment on before we break for coffee, Minister?
Thank you, Zainab. I wanted to make two very brief comments. One is on gender development. You asked a question of why gender as opposed to national development, because everybody is supposed to be involved in the development process. And I want to advocate very strongly for women as a very important component of development. And in fact, I would like to challenge those of us who are working on the evaluation of MDGs to look at the impact of women in the achievement of MDGs by 2015. I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, that the fact that women are connected directly to all the targets of the Millennium Development Goals, whether it's nutrition, women's health, education, clean water, especially the rural women, is an indication that the more women are involved at the lowest level, at the grassroots level, in the villages, in the communities, is going to be a very important determining factor on the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. Also very quickly on dialogue, which we've discussed a lot this morning, to say that we did not as a nation engage in dialogue right after the genocide and stopped. That dialogue continues today. And in fact, every December, we have one coming up next month. Every December, different representative sections of our society meet in our parliament chamber, and the President of the Republic chairs a meeting over 2 days where we check ourselves out. We talk about what has worked and what hasn't worked during the year. We have the citizens call in on the phone, by SMSs, this year on Twitter. We have Rwandans in the diaspora from various parts of the world coming into this national dialogue. So it's not something that ends because we become comfortable about where we are in terms of reconciliation and development. It's an ongoing process. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Foreign Minister, and thank you to Bella Bird, Country Director of Sudan from the World Bank, and Professor Frederick Goloba from Makerere University in Kampala. We will resume our discussions at 11:30, please, after we've had a coffee break. And just to tell you that after coffee, we're going to work right up until lunchtime, so that will be our final break before the end of this gathering. So thank you very much indeed in the meantime for your attention. Thank you.
abakomeje gukurikira gahunda za televiziyo y'u Rwanda, turacyari mu nama yo ku rwego rwo hejuru yo kureba uko amahoro yakwimakazwa inyuma y'amakimbirane. Havuzwe byinshi muri iki gitondo, ariko ikiganiro cyo muri iki gitondo cyaganiraga cyane cyane ku buryo u Rwanda rwakoresheje kugira ngo rwongere kuzamura imibereho myiza y'abaturage, kugira ngo rwongere kugera ku byiza rwagezeho, ndetse kugira ngo abantu bari hano, abatumirwa, abanyacyubahiro batandukanye batumiwe muri iyi nama nabo babashe kubyigiraho. Akaba ari nayo mpamvu rero abanyarwanda bagiye batanga ibyagezweho, ibyizwe bituruka mu muco nyarwanda kugira ngo bibashe gukoreshwa mu gihe cy'ubungu. Muri akanya rero bagiye mu karuhuko gatoya, bari bugaruke mu kanya. Turakomeza kubana namwe tubagezaho imirimo y'inama, ndetse tubagezaho ibiganiro bitandukanye abari hano bagenda bagira. Akaruhuko kari bumare igihe kitari kinini cyane, turongera kubonana mu kanya.
Okay.
Bareka rero mukomeze mukurikire gahunda z'imirimo y'inama nyine uko zikomeza gukurikirana.
And economic growth rate in Rwanda is 8.8%, so Campetta, you must be doing something right. So please give us your introductory comments on lessons from Rwanda on the effective use of aid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zena. I think this was very flattering. Hope I'll live up to the introduction you've made. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'll try and focus mainly on the how rather than the what. I think most of us have participated in aid effectiveness meetings, and it tends to be the same thing coming up again about harmonization, alignment, coordination, and sometimes I think there's a bit of fatigue on these. So I'll try and focus on Rwanda specifically. I think the first thing that helped us in Rwanda is before dealing with aid management, let me call it aid management, because really a full-time job for some people, you have to deal with government affairs management, meaning how do you set up your internal political systems to develop policies, and that needs to be very clear before you start trying to organize development partners, whether you're talking about NGOs or donors. The first thing we agreed upon was that this was going to be, aid management was going to be a centralized system, meaning that it is centralized from the Ministry of Finance. And all the policy discussion take place a bit like I would say, in the kitchen, before they are brought to the table to be discussed with development partners. And that allows us to have one voice as a government. I think Dr. Binagwaho, Minister of Health, said it very well. You need to engage donors as one government as opposed to scattered institutions. And I would say that is really the foundation of your engagement. The second thing was really to say aid to do what, and we had to have a very fundamental discussion within government. And the focus was really the focus of delivery of services and delivery of reforms for the population. And as you have people-centered reforms, you have to, I would say, take risks in a way, because what you do is really, sorry, I think we should welcome His Excellency, President.
Your Excellency, President Paul Kagame, welcome to our continuing discussions on peace and state building. We are very glad to have you with us. And we have just started this session after coffee, and we are looking at lessons from Rwanda in terms of aid effectiveness. And the wonderful Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning here, Kampeta Sayinzoga, has just started off by giving us her perspective. And all she has said at the moment so far is that the key thing is to present a united face to donor nations and to the donor community, so that a government such as Rwanda speaks with one voice, that you don't have competing and conflicting interests from different departments and so on. And that's where she was speaking. And Kampeta, please do pick up where you were speaking from.
Thank you very much, Zainab. So as I was saying, the first thing that we had to agree is what were going to be the priorities at a particular point of time, and these change over time quite clearly. But often we agree on what are the priorities, but there is less of a discussion of what are lesser priorities. Let me call them like that, not like non-priorities, but lesser priorities. And this was a discussion that we had to have with donors to make it clear as to where government was going to focus on, both in the post-genocide period and as we move towards less of humanitarian assistance to more development assistance. The one thing that we had to put very clearly across the table is that time was of essence. And as you deliver reform, as you deliver for your citizens, time really matters. Because if you start a reform and it takes you 10 years, not only is there fatigue from the side of the administration, but there's also a lack of credibility towards your citizen. And that prevents you from carrying further reforms or bolder reforms at a later stage. People often ask us, after the genocide, did you have aid first or delivery first? And I would say they come hand in hand. Of course, you need one or two donors that are ready to take a risk on you. And we had the benefits of having, I would say particularly like DFID and the World Bank, take a bold step, give us budget support before we could put in place all the steps, and that really helps. But as you want to mobilize more resources, both domestically and internationally, what's very important is that you can communicate on your achievements, on your successes, and on your delivery. The second question that we get very often is, how do you ensure that aid is used wisely? And the first thing we always say is, of course, you have to create systems that hold you accountable to your own citizens before focusing on accountability. What I want to say really is some countries put in systems to become accountable to donors only. But if you develop very strong systems to make you accountable to your citizens, then you can use the same systems to actually be accountable to donors. So when we talk about Rwanda being transparent, being accountable for every dollar from aid that is being used, it's because we're also accountable for every Rwandan franc that we get from taxation to our own citizens. And these are the same systems that we actually use to be accountable to donors during our dialogue with them. Two modalities really matter. I think yesterday our brother from Southern Sudan mentioned budget support. And we engaged the donors very openly. We actually had an aid policy that was adopted by Cabinet that said very clearly that budget support was our preferred modality of aid. And we had a very open discussion with donors as to what did they need to make the case back home to be able to move from projects or scattered interventions into a consolidated budget support. And that was really useful. Of course, you have issues of public financial management, which we focused a lot on, not only for donors, but for our own citizens. But we also had open discussions about issues of political governance. And in our dialogue, we try to avoid having anything as a taboo. So everything is on the table, and when we have disagreements, we have disagreements quite openly. Then the issue of coordination, how do you coordinate? Our experience is that the simpler the aid architecture in the country, the better for governments, because then you can remain in charge. Often we don't have the same human resource available to deal with, I would say, these coordination structures. So if you have 1,000 coordination structures, you find that you're growing very thin, and it's very difficult for you to have a consolidated dialogue. So we have few forums, all, I would say, that culminate under the umbrella of the Ministry of Finance, but in which every single government department, NGO, private sector, civil society gets engaged. So really the formula that we've used is to keep it as simple as possible. And then measuring success in a way that's very transparent. We agree on indicators, we agree on what's going to be done, and we assess that in a way that is independent, and then have discussions on results. Now, if you don't do that, the risk is really that you start discussing process and have endless discussions about whether the procurement was done, which is important, but is not an end in its own. So having a discussion on outcome and outputs and measuring them quite clearly and transparently, and discussing really success and delivery is really key to avoid lengthy and windy discussions. Now, as you measure success, you need to set your own standards, and that's a discussion that we've had with donors that's sometimes a bit of a difficult discussion. You find that Rwanda often at the beginning was getting compared with other, I would say, with failed states, and say, oh, but Rwanda is doing so well, is doing better than this and this country, which is actually a failed state. And we said, no, we don't want to be compared to failed state, we want to be compared to success stories. And we're setting our own standards to internationally agreed standards and not to failed state standards. And as you set your standard, then it gives a lot of weight to what you do and how you do it and how you engage donors. And also, it avoids what I call the cost of bad advice, because there's a lot of bad advice out there that is based on very low standards. Then finally, I wanted to share with you the Rwandan, we call Rwandan innovations in aid effectiveness. The first one is division of labor. You may have heard about it. We've discussed with development partners, with donors actually in this case, and agreed that they would intervene only in 3 sectors and have no more than 3 to 4 projects or 3 to 4 interventions. What it means is you have less scattered intervention, and you as a government can decide where you want them to take place, to intervene without having competing interventions. So division of labor, what we call division of labor, which is basically deciding which donor will intervene in which sector, and limited has really helped focus the dialogue. The second one is mutual accountability. We have actually put in place a system, which is like a traffic light system, where as government, we say, this is what we're going to do in the next 12 months. But development partners also tell us what are they going to do to make sure the quality of their aid improves over time. And then we meet and we actually give them traffic lights. So red is for underperforming, if a donor has not reached its target. Orange means they're getting there, green is they've met their target. So we hold each other mutually accountable. So the idea really is that as you give us better quality aid, it also helps us to achieve better results. And then the last one is really using aid for private sector development. We've realized really that as aid, having donor money directly invested into the private sector helps us widen our tax base, and eventually will accelerate weaning off aid, which is at the end, I would say, the bottom line of the discussion. So as we look at the bottom line, we try to discuss more specifically how can we use this money to actually win or get us off away from aid and away from dependency or any feeling of dependency. And I would say it's working quite well, because as we started, 86% of our budget was actually aid financed. Today we're down to 45, and we're laying strategies as we widen the tax base to try and lower it to actually reach 0 as soon as possible. And that involves a lot of job creation, a lot of activities or interventions that also tackle the macroeconomic environment. So in a nutshell, I think...
Thank you very much indeed, Campetta Sayinzoga. And Campetta, just before you put your microphone down, yesterday President Kagame talked about the importance of the alignment of the national budget with the country's poverty reduction strategy. You've talked about how you have to involve the people, but just give us a few sentences on the government-led working groups that you have set up to use aid effectively to meet the national priorities that you have set out. Just how does it work in practice?
I would say the first step is really to have a clear strategy, whether you're talking about a vision 2020 or a medium-term framework, and that really comes from the grassroots. So as we develop sectoral strategies or medium-term strategies, we really have a bottom-up approach. And then once we have clarity and endorsement of these strategies, then we have development partners forum, which is at the level of heads of agencies in country, which I co-chair with the UN resident coordinator, which meets on a quarterly basis, and where we discuss progress, we discuss how these strategies need to be maybe realigned and we also have a different forum specifically for budget support donors, because they basically give us a check out of trust and out of confidence of our system. So we feel we need to also give them direct feedback on how this money has been.
How do you elect those people at the grassroots, or do you feel that somebody from civil society might be better able to comment on that later? How do you actually engage people at the community level? How do you find them? How do you identify them, these working groups?
Actually, I think civil society can answer, but from what we do as a ministry in charge of national planning is already at the community. There is the community is already organized, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned, through Budehe, through the various social programs. So we use the same organization. We don't create new groups. We use the same groups that are organized under Budehe to do consultations. And what we do is we basically start often from scratch, and we say, this is the question. If we're talking about, for example, social empowerment, we say, what do you think are the 3 top interventions that could help the poorest of the poor of your community? And they come up with ideas, and then we match these ideas with the evidence that we have at the national level, and that constitutes the base. So it comes from the already organized communities, it goes up through the administrative, what we call the administrative entities, which are the districts, and then the districts feed it back to central government. In this case, it would be the line ministries and the ministry in charge of planning.
Thank you very much indeed. Michel Arion, you are head of the EU delegation to Rwanda here. You've been in Kigali for the last 2 years. You are Belgian, a lawyer by training, a self-confessed workaholic. Is that right? You know Africa well. You've worked in development for 20 years at the European Union. You've lived in various countries in Africa, such as Côte d'Ivoire, and specialising very much in countries in crisis and post-conflict societies. Listening to what Kampeta Saying-Zorga said there, and your wider perspective as well, the donor community obviously is very, very keen in ensuring that there is accountability for any donor money, particularly at a time like this, when a financial crisis is really squeezing many donor budgets. And I know it's something that your Development Commissioner, Anders Pilsberg, has talked about a great deal, very much of late. So just give us the donor perspective in terms of aid effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, I would like to offer a few comments from, I prefer to say it, partners' perspective than donors, because we are partners in the political field, we are partners in the development field. But also as someone who has been living here for almost 2 years and who starts perhaps to understand a few things of this country. I think the most important thing that we can witness here in Rwanda is an extremely committed leadership. And under leadership, I mean leadership from the top to the grassroots level. So at each and every step of not only the administration, but also the organization of this country, you will find committed leaders. Committed to what? Well, basically, I would say committed to the stability and the security of their country, which is of course of primary importance for a country like Rwanda, but also to the development of their country. And what is very important, it's a fair and equitable development. And I really want to underline the word equitable development. That's extremely important. I think Professor Mutebi this morning and also the Minister of Health mentioned the fact that the growth and the benefits of development are equally and fairly redistributed to everyone in this country, not only in Kigali, but also in the provinces, in the regions, and it benefits really to the poorest fringes of the population. So frankly, sometimes we read articles about the fact that Rwanda development is just for Kigali and the rich people. It's not true. It's really not true, and I hope that very soon with the survey on the household in Rwanda, we will be able to demonstrate scientifically that the development is for everyone. And I would like also to flag in particular two programs just to illustrate that. It's the program on social protection. I think people this morning have mentioned the VUP and also the Ubudehe programs. Those really benefit to the poorest of the rural areas in Rwanda. Also the mutuelle de santé, the health community, is really an incredibly well-functioning system which gives access to everyone to a health cover. So we have committed people, we have committed leadership in front of us to dialogue with, but we have also accountable people. It was already said yesterday. I think it's very important. They are accountable vis-à-vis their own people, being through the executive chain of command or before the parliament or before the auditor general. So they have accounts to show to their to various instances. So we donors or partners, we do benefit from this accountability as well. So I think that this concept of accountability is also extremely important, and we must understand that it starts at home, the accountability. A word perhaps on ownership. It has been also said several times yesterday and this morning, but again I want to repeat that there is true ownership in this country. The Rwandans, they own their strategies, they own their policies. No consultant wrote the Vision 2020. No consultant wrote the poverty reduction strategy paper. In too many countries, in too many instances, we have seen consultants or UN agencies or the World Bank or even the EU, where I want to put me in the same basket, writing on behalf of a government a policy paper and asking the minister to sign. This is not the way it works here in Rwanda, and I think it's extremely important. So to use a common expression, the Rwandans are really in the driving seat. And not the driving seat of the taxi driver who is just going in the direction of his client, but really the direction in which the country wants to go. So we've got leadership, we've got accountability, we've got ownership. The last thing we really have with we partners with the government is dialogue. And I would say there are two types of dialogues. The political dialogue and the policy dialogue. In French it's a bit difficult to translate, it's dialogue politique, but it's dialogue politique, political dialogue, but also dialogue on the policies. The political dialogue, it's very important because we are today at a conference on post-conflict situation, on peace building, on state building, and as it was rightly mentioned in one of the background documents we were given, state building is a highly political exercise, and I think the partners have to give political answers and offer political solutions to political problems. So for that we need a political dialogue with Rwanda, and we can have it and we have it, and I think it's extremely important. On policy dialogue, or dialogue on the policies, the sector policies, we have a very elaborated system of sector working groups and clusters where the donors, the partners do discuss with the government in the field of education, health, infrastructure, water, energy, etc., all technical sectors of development, but also governance and also decentralization or cross-cutting issues. We have this framework of sector working groups where we can have this dialogue. So, to summarize, with those four elements that I mentioned, ownership, leadership, accountability, and dialogue, I don't see any difficulty in Rwanda for the donors to apply the agenda of the aid effectiveness. And Campetta mentioned the system of division of labor. It is really working well and effectively, not more than 3 donors per sectors, not more than 3 sectors per donors, plus those who give budget support. And that is, I think, very important. Those 4 elements that I mentioned and do allow us, the donors, but in particular the European Union, to channel most of our aid through budget support. And budget support is the mean of the tool for channeling aid, the most development channel to indeed align ourselves to the priorities and the policies of the government.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
indeed, Michel Arion. And picking up on something that Campeter and both of you have talked about, Campeter talked about the transition from humanitarian aid to sustainable economic planning. So from your experience of Africa, not just Rwanda, when is the time right? How do you judge when a country has reached the minimum level in terms of capacity requirements for it to assume this national ownership of its own program that you say is so important? How do you assess this?
Well, I do believe that it's not consecutive phases. You don't go from humanitarian to reconstruction and from reconstruction to development. The sooner you can start reconstruction and development, the better. So I worked, for instance, in Liberia. At the same time, we were delivering humanitarian aid in health, reconstruction in infrastructure, and development in education. So depending the sectors, depending the region, depending the most affected areas, depending the analysis that you do in terms of the quality of the leadership, the quality of the ownership, the quality of the policy in a given sector or in a given region, you can apply the three policies at the same time. And I think it's very important to understand that, because sometimes people want to make a distinction between the interventions of the humanitarian agencies or of the development agencies. I think it's exactly the same. They have to work together, but the sooner the government takes over the ownership and the leadership, the better.
But be honest, it's going to be difficult, though, for you to get the assessment and the accountability that you want when you are in the midst of a crisis for aid. I mean, it's easier in Rwanda, but not so easy in some other countries.
It's indeed not easy in many countries, and I was reflecting this morning on this the issue we discussed yesterday on the concept of one size does not fit all. It's true. So is Rwanda replicable? Is Rwanda really a model for the other countries? It is probably an ideal model for many countries, but is it really achievable in those countries? I think so. I think yes, it is possible, but that will need a lot of energy and a lot of commitment from the leaders of the countries emerging from a conflict. And as it was also mentioned this morning, it takes time to emerge from a conflict, and relapse occur very, very often. So I think it's good to keep in certain regions, in certain countries, in certain sectors, humanitarian assistance, because it takes really time to come to a point where you can have a full development policy applied in a given sector. But we know that, and we do our analysis of a situation of a country is made in full knowledge of those different concepts of relief or development, which are different, but again, I repeat, can happen at the same time.
Thank you very much indeed. And our other panel member, Gabriel Negatu, Ethiopian-born, but has spent most of his adult life in the United States, where you've worked in development as an independent consultant for various bodies like UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, the World Bank, and the IMF, and you joined the African Development Bank in 1998, and you are currently the Director for East Africa for the ADB. And just listening to what your two fellow panelists have said in this regard of giving support to establish measures for financial accountability and budget support and so on, do give us your perspective from this region. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Zainab. Let me perhaps take off from where Michel left, where he was talking about Rwanda being in the driver's seat. Okay. Let me take off from where Michel's comment about Rwanda being in the driver's seat. I think, frankly, I am of the view now that this is almost becoming a cliche. Rwanda is in the driver's seat. We've said this too long and too many years. I think what is important when we talk about this country now is not that Rwanda is in the driver's seat, but we need to talk about the direction of travel. Where is this country heading? Where is it traveling to? The issue of being in the driver's seat is what I would call the new normal. You know, it's the new normal. It's no longer an exception. But what is untold, and then the story that needs to be told is, where is this country traveling? And then I think I will sort of touch on that. Also, before I kick off my comment, I very much enjoyed Campeta's presentation, and just for your information, Zainab, imagine having to sit across the table and negotiate with the likes of Campeta in this country, and believe me, there are many Campetas in this country. So I think it's a tribute to what I yesterday called indigenous capacity, which Rwanda is managed to build quite well. Now, let me kick off by quoting Paul Collier, who's I think known to most of you. In his book, The Bottom Billion, he argues the multidimensional aspect of post-conflict situations, whereby post-conflict countries are left with weak institutions, destroyed socioeconomic infrastructure, and fragile security issues. And then he argues that this in turn reduces economic growth by as much as 2 to 3% per year. Now, 2 to 3% per year reduction in growth, which in turn leads to more conflict. So he phrases this concept as the conflict trap. He calls it the conflict trap. And the question is, how did Rwanda manage to break out of this conflict trap, and how can we get other countries, emerging countries or out of conflict, break out of this conflict trap? And it's in this context that the issue of strategic and effective use of aid becomes paramount. Aid is a resource that needs to be managed strategically and effectively to break out of this trap. But again, the Rwanda experience, as I sort of hinted at yesterday, was Rwanda was able to break out of this trap around 3 pillars: the issue of visionary leadership, capable institutions, and indigenous capacity. I think these are the pillars that have helped Rwanda come out of this. Now, for most countries coming out of a similar situation, could we talk about Somalia, South Sudan, and several others, the priority action, of course, is to be able to attract adequate amounts of aid in the initial phase. You know, in an environment where aid is declining and where donor partners have their own agenda, it becomes a challenge to attract the right amount of aid. And this is a priority that needs to be nuanced in the process. I think a recent study by OECD showed that most countries coming out of conflict in this continent depend on a single donor. Now get this story. Depend on a single donor for more than 50% of their ODA. I think that puts any country at the mercy of a single donor, most likely the traditional or the previous colonial partner. So you have a situation of what you call aid orphans, where a country is in dire need of aid and doesn't get the right level of aid. Or on the other extreme, you have a situation called the aid tsunami, where every donor is running to your country, to a given country, with all kind of aids. And the challenge is to find that careful balance between aid orphans and aid tsunami. Now, what is required, as the topic here is, what is required to effectively use the resources that come from aid? I think for donors or for countries like Rwanda and others, and this is where I think we can learn from the example of Rwanda, is that a country must have its own national strategy, fully prioritized, sequenced, and costed. So it cannot be a Christmas tree of everything that needs to be done, but it needs to be prioritized and sequenced, and more importantly, fully owned by the government and the people of a country. And again here, I think this is where very early this country was able to zoom in and come up with these kind of things. But it is not enough. It is not enough to have this. Even after you have done this, there's no guarantee that the ODA that's required will come in. I think to earn the confidence of donors and to get their resources, there are other factors that need to come in, and these are issues like transparency and accountability in the use of aid. Transparency and accountability in the use of your own domestic resources within a framework of a good governance context in any country. The issue of strengthening institutions, strengthening country systems. I know in this country, in the very early years, a lot of emphasis was put on strengthening the Rwanda Revenue Authority, the Auditor General, the Ombudsman, and so on. These are the institutions of accountability and transparency that have ensured, that continue to ensure that aid resources and domestic resources as well as are going to what they're supposed to be used for. Commitment to inclusive growth. And lastly, commitment to tracking this aid and tracking the results that come out of it. I should share with you, recently I attended an event in Kigali in the parliament called the Imahigo. And this is an experience that, in fact, I have tried to introduce in the other countries that I am responsible for. This is basically where government and the different provinces and agree on a work program, agree on a budget, and implementation takes place. At the end of the year, they come together and sort of peer assess each other to see who has delivered, who has not, and more importantly, discuss why. I think this is the kind of results I'm talking about. It is not only for donors, but it's also for the domestic resources that this country itself has raised. So I think these are the conditions. But last issue that I think is important for the country is the need for a strategy to wean the country off from aid. And I think in this regard, we should salute Rwanda as it is now given as an example across the board as a country that has now given itself a soft time frame to wean itself from aid to becoming self-sufficient. Campetta talked about dependency on donor aid coming down from 80 to 40. I think in the near future, in the next few years, we will see Rwanda, like a few other countries, become less dependent on aid and more dependent on FDI and domestic resources. I think this is very important. For donors or for partners, I think the lessons from Rwanda and other regions is, one is the issue of predictability. You know, for a minister of finance in any given country, but particularly in a fragile or post-conflict country, more important than the amount of resources coming is the predictability of that resource. To know and to put it in the budget that X amount of resource will be available during this budget year. And I think as donors have other political and other considerations, there is usually a tendency to cut aid. So there's a need to do that. The second is for flexibility of instruments. You know, when you give aid, there are several ways of giving aid. Campetta and Michel talked about budget support. In some countries that are not ready for budget support, you have balance of payment support. You have technical assistance support. So it's important that we don't go for a straitjacket and say, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. It can be budget support, balance of payment, investment projects, but the aid must fit the situation in the country. It must fit, it must be customized to fit the situation in the country. And the third, the last is the commitment for sustained partnership. Coming out of conflict is not something you do easily. The risk of reversing back into conflict is very much alive. So there is a need for commitment over the long term. Lastly, let me just say that in the final analysis, this is not a destination that you head to and say, now we have arrived. What is important in Rwanda and in other places is the direction of travel and the trajectory of change. If a country is moving in the right direction, and if the trajectory of change is the right one, then I think we can celebrate that country as being successful.
So are you saying there, Gabriel, then, that there's a level where you say, okay, there's good enough governance, there is good enough inclusive growth because it's going in the right way?
It is, well, good enough governance is a rather loaded concept, and I don't think we will get into that in this meeting, but I think good enough inclusive is indeed important, because coming out of conflict, there is a trade-off. It cannot be having everything at the same time, and that's the issue of sequencing and prioritization. You know, do you go for stabilization or do you go for growth? And clearly there are trade-offs on both sides. So good enough inclusive growth and participation invariably itself leads to good enough governance. And I think, again, you have a very poignant example in this country where the shift is very apparent, but you may actually, you know, to be frank, you may agree or disagree with what has happened in this country. What is sure is you cannot disagree about the results. The results are on the ground. You may agree or disagree on the trajectory of travel or the direction taken, but we cannot disagree about the results on the ground.
Thank you. Okay. President Kagame and Prime Minister Soro, I will invite comments from you perhaps at the end of this particular session on what you have heard, both our panel and what the floor will say. So I will invite you to make some comments, if you so wish. Yes? Okay, good. But I'd like to go to the Deputy Prime Minister of Timor-Leste, who is the current chair of the G7 Plus group on the International Dialogue on Fragile States, because I think your input in this regard, in terms of aid effectiveness, is a very interesting one. Please.
Thank you. And great also to have Mr. President of Rwanda here this morning. G7 Plus is an initiative from the Ministers of Finance from some countries that are also represented here. After the meeting in South Sudan just recently, G7 Plus became 90 member nations. It does represent over 350 million, but it's a forum and that advocates for, I believe that around 1.5 billion people that live in fragile, whether it is economic or institutional, and in post-conflict, in conflict-affected countries. The focus of this group is to, together with the international dialogue partners, is to find better ways that the international aid be more effective in the receiving countries. If we just read the data from many international institutions or countries, we can sometimes ask ourselves, in the case of Timor-Leste, I believe that up to now some institutions say that the money that went to Timor is more than $1 billion during these years, and the Timorese people ask ourselves where the money goes, where the money went. So we don't sometimes see the visible transformation of the country resulted from this such amount of the money. That's why what the permanent secretary of Minister of Economy of Rwanda just said about transparency and accountability to our own people and to development parties is a crucial steps. And in Timor we have done that. And today what G7 Plus is doing is to enter into dialogue with development partners and to see how to see if we can agree on what we call a new deal of aid that currently is being negotiated in Paris with international dialogue partners, and that is many developed nations are part of this international network of countries with the same aim, that is to have the more effective aid to the receiving countries. Right now these discussions are proceeding, and the aim is that when we get to Busan, we can have an agreement there. And from the experience that we have is that the current international situation also, I think that everybody, even in Europe, America, and in our own countries, we are in a process of reflection if the economic systems that we have up to date has been successful, or how to change some of the systems that we have in order to that the economy benefits all. And the idea that we have for the G7 post-conflict countries is that if we can, for example, in the peacebuilding, the state building, in order to achieve the MDGs that are very important for all of us, if we can have 5 of the aims. One is that a state for all, safety for all, number 2. Number 3 is equity for all, and then 4 jobs for all, and 5 service for all. Then we can have more progress. And but again, this is a process in which we are all made reflections, and development partners as well as receiving countries like ours. One thing is important, that we want that the resource that comes from taxpayers from Europe or other countries be implemented in a proper way in our countries. And another, for us, it's more important also that our own people knows where the money goes, because otherwise we will read in newspapers that country A or B has received $500 million or $100 million, and our population one day will come to us and say, where is the money, where it goes. So this kind of transparent accountability is a very important one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it is something you hear in so many places in the world. Where has all the money gone? Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister of East Timor. I showed generosity to you because you were not only speaking on behalf of East Timor, but a whole body of countries that are described as fragile. However, I should not be so generous with subsequent interventions if you're speaking on behalf of your nation. So, may I invite interventions from the floor, please, on this issue of aid effectiveness. And Professor Gambari, is that you there? Yes. Briefly, if you will, please. You can get lots of
Yeah, absolutely. No, you asked a question about when does countries emerging from conflict transit from humanitarian assistance to early recovery and development. And I thought I had Michelle of the EU seem to suggest that it should be concurrent, not a consecutive process. And he referred to the case of Liberia, where there were emergence from conflict, there was development things taking place, recovery issues taking place. And this tallies with what the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance said, that peace dividends are demanded by people or countries emerging from conflict, and you have to do it as a matter of urgency, otherwise government loses credibility. I think this is a clear lesson for us in Darfur, where in Darfur, we of the peacekeeping African Union and UN, we have trouble persuading the UN country team to embark on projects of early recovery and development, because they feel that the situation is not ripe enough for that. And I think what we'll take away from this is to strengthen our hands, that you can't wait till all of Darfur are peace before you do things that could actually help to build the peace and to address the root causes of conflict, particularly in the area of water. Thank you.
Thank you. A point very well made. Thank you. Other speakers from the floor, please. Bella Bird, Country Director for the two Sudans at the World Bank.
Thank you very much for a really stimulating set of panel presentations. I just wanted to follow up on 3 points which really struck me from, I used to work with East Timor co-chairing the International Dialogue, which facilitated the G7+. And we spent a lot of time talking about, analysing and talking about the problems with aid in fragile states. And now they're coming to Busan with a new deal, which the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, which I would urge everybody to support, joining Judy's voice yesterday. I think that's a really good set of ideas in that new deal. But what I really liked about particularly the Rwanda presentation was the way you focused on the how. And, okay, let's move beyond all the grievances that we've got about aid, and aid in fragile states particularly, and into okay, how do we make this work? And 3 things that struck me were with the leadership issue. And I think we know, and it's well documented, that when governments lead the way in terms of donors, they're much more likely to get a good result from the aid money. And donors, I've never seen, I've worked in a number of countries, and I've never seen or read about a single situation where donors have successfully managed to organise themselves to deliver on countries' priorities without strong leadership from government. And that's really key. And what I'd say is looking at that leadership, I think I can differentiate between the countries in which I've been involved in where they set up a good structure for aid coordination and where they combine structure with substance. And I think what really struck me about the case of Rwanda and another country I've worked with, Vietnam, it reminded me a lot about Vietnam, which is possibly the most effective country I've actually worked with in terms of getting the best out of aid, was that you've got a clear sense of where you're going and therefore how you want donors to align and deliver. If you don't have that within the aid coordination structure, then you have lots of meetings, lots of donors putting together matrices with long lists of projects, but no real sense of direction and delivery. And I think that's where you really seem to me to have a very strong edge. Just a couple more points. You mentioned results and the fact that if you're delivering results, you can keep your donors happy. I think that's a really important point. There's a lot of noise in the international system around results at the moment. Taxpayers back in Western countries feeling the pinch, focus on results, and we need to start looking much more at how we can so we can support you to deliver results, and then we tell the story back home to taxpayers and a hostile press and a sceptical board of directors or whatever it is that we have to, whatever our governing structure is. And then finally, I just want to put a note of caution in about what some of the things we've learned. It's in the WDR and it's in other analysis about the danger of donors doing harm in fragile countries, and the need for self-awareness and the need for an understanding of the context to form the way that we do our business. And I'm thinking back to some of the points made this morning and I think by the Foreign Minister of Rwanda around equity being the key to everything in Rwanda. When I worked in Nepal, we did an analysis of poverty, conflict and aid, a mapping. And we found that where poverty and conflict was most significant in the country, aid was scarce. And I think there's new innovations now coming into the way that we can look at these issues to try and make sure that we're not doing harm in the way we do business.
I'm obviously not a very stern chair because everybody disregards what I say about time. Please, yes, a brief comment from you, sir, if you would introduce yourself.
Thank you, Zainab. I am Jose Nsengimana, Ambassador of Rwanda to Addis Ababa, to Ethiopia. Closing the remarks made by Gitu, you put him a question. You asked him if it was good enough. I just want to try to answer that question. I think in the case of Rwanda, I can say yes and no. Yes, because a target is reached, but the process is continuous. So I can say no, because the target reached becomes automatically a new beginning. And it is a new beginning for a bigger step. So each achievement puts in a new challenge, and the process has no end. It is a question, once again, a question of values in Rwanda. For us, you know, the sky is the only limit. So the progress is continuous. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. Yes, other interventions from the floor. This is the last opportunity for interventions from the floor. I think I see the Ambassador of Switzerland, Paul Sager, Swiss Ambassador to the United Nations. Briefly, if you would, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Zaina. Just one or two sentences. I think in the current international budgetary and financial environment where international aid is getting scarcer, strategic aid effectiveness is all the more important than before. So there are countries who are not as far yet as Rwanda, and I speak actually in my capacity as the Burundi chair. I think they have not come as far yet, and they need immediate needs and also the long-term needs. And there is a certain, to just throw a stone in this tranquil sea of consensus we are having here. I have at times the impression that the international donors, and I'm speaking now directly to the World Bank and also the African Development Bank, they have a clear vision for the long-term needs, talking about infrastructure, long-term economic development, but the short-term needs, which are more political, like social reintegration of ex-combatants and things like that, there I, frankly speaking, still fail to see the understanding of the world, of the banks. You know, it's for them political, and therefore they don't want to touch it. So therefore, I think there is an appeal to kickstart the motor, and we also need to address these needs, and then to get the motor running and have a long-term commitment. Last word, maybe political accompaniment is important, and I think in that respect, another remark which struck me in a meeting of 2 days, which was co-sponsored by the Peacebuilding Commission. Hardly any word has been made about the Peacebuilding Commission. I think it's playing really an important role as a complement, as a guarantee, as a safety net for getting aid. So I think that's maybe also an issue we have to talk about in the future. Thank you very much.
They are going to speak, and a Swiss representative as a revolutionary, you're all about consensual politics, so there we are. We will let you incorporate your response to that. Burundi, did you want to respond at all or make a comment? Did I see a hand here? Is it Burundi? Yes? Yeah, please, briefly if you would, sir, and then I will go to President Kagame and Prime Minister Soro.
Yes, it's really a question to the Permanent Secretary Minister of Finance. The aid really comes in various forms, as she tried to analyze in terms of budget support, balance of payment, etc., etc. But there is one particular aid that I would like to have the Rwandan experience, how they have been able to manage it. That is, even after the relief situation has ceased, certain countries still continue to channel their aid through NGOs. And it is that aspect really, for some of us, the aid coming through NGOs is sometimes likely elusive. One cannot easily account for them. So I would like to know how far Rwanda has been able to capture that into their development aid management.
Okay, thank you. When we have our concluding remarks from our panelists here, will you incorporate your responses both to that point and also from the Swiss ambassador? President Kagame and Prime Minister Soro, would you wish to make your comments now, or do you want to make them after, at the very end, before we break for lunch? What's your preference?
I think you can use my time for somebody else to...
Okay.
Yes, I'm happy with what I'm hearing.
You're listening?
Yes, I'm listening.
You're letting other people be in the driving seat for now. Prime Minister Guillaume Soro, would you wish to make any comment on what you've heard about aid effectiveness and anything else you've heard this morning?
Je suivrai le conseil du président Kagame et je serai aussi généreux que lui.
All right, I was just observing protocol there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for our interventions from the floor. We don't have much longer before we go for lunch, so if you would just incorporate your closing statements from what you've heard from the floor. Michel Arion from the European Union.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's important what our colleague from the World Bank said, that no donor or no partner is able to deliver better in terms of coordination or efficiency than the country itself. And we don't know many cases, or any case, where a donor has been able to replace a country. I must say I was very happy to hear the Vice Prime Minister of Timor speaking on behalf of the G7+ and insisting on transparency. It's extremely important, and domestic, as I said in my preliminary remarks, the domestic accountability is the platform upon which you can build accountability vis-à-vis your donors or your partners. The last remark, we have heard several times the reference to the taxpayer, the EU taxpayer or the American taxpayer, etc. It is true that as aid agencies we are responsible vis-à-vis the taxpayer, but if I compare the budget, the aid budget, with other budgets, I feel not very comfortable, because I think that we probably have spent 10 times or 20 times or 100 times our aid budget in Libya or in Iraq or in Afghanistan, and I don't hear that reference of the EU taxpayer vis-à-vis the expenditures of the colleagues from the Defense Ministry. Someone mentioned the Peacebuilding Commission. It would be very interesting to compare the budget of the Peacebuilding Commission with the budget of peacekeeping operations. It must be, again, 10, 20, 100 times. Prime Minister Soro knows how much ONUSI mission cost to the international taxpayer. If Côte d'Ivoire could benefit from 1/10 of the cost of this mission for development purpose, I think he would be very happy. So we are spending fortunes on military expenditures and peacekeeping operations without, I mean, we have been doing that for 10 years in Côte d'Ivoire, 10 years in Liberia, 10 years in Sierra Leone, for nothing, I'm sorry to say. So the taxpayer is to be aware of that. So he better question those expenditures.
Are you making them aware with your voice when you go back to your Brussels? Are you making them aware? You say that kind of thing to them there?
It's done already.
Do they listen to you?
Yes, they take note.
Oh, good. All right. Campetta Sainzoga, if you would like to make your concluding remarks, incorporating some of the points put from the floor, particularly the representative from Burundi.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Maybe just to start by answering the concern from my colleague from Sierra Leone. What we've done is we've been very open about aid through NGOs. We've actually clearly put it on the table that we think that now we have a government that is capable of delivering. And all official development assistance should be channeled through government. Now, that doesn't mean that government cannot work with NGOs. We do use NGOs to implement some of our programs or policies, but we've made it clear that we will not sign on any aid that is directly delivered to NGOs, and that we think that the right channel is through government first. At the beginning, to be quite honest, we've had a lot of resistance from the development partners, but we've put our foot down, and the truth is it's very difficult for some development partners to actually use or leverage resources back home without the support of the government. So when you make it clear like this, it's actually a way of making sure that the money is channeled through you, maybe to have NGOs as implementers, just like we use the private sector as implementers, but not as primary beneficiaries of official development assistance. Of course, that goes with building the confidence that your government is actually capable of accounting for this money. What we've also shown is the lack of transparency, actually, in the use of funds from NGOs, which is quite shocking. I think it's something that we've discussed in our development partners meeting as to how much money is actually going through NGOs and is never accounted for, rather to the beneficiaries or actually to the donor themselves. So we have put ourselves in a position where they get better accountability from government than actually from most of the NGOs, either international or local for that matter. The second point that I wanted to make is really when Rwanda started after the genocide, we were accused many times of being dreamers, of being too ambitious. And many donors did not believe that we could do what we did. And I think with time, we've proven that being ambitious as a post-conflict country is a good thing. And it's something that is actually possible and something that should not be laughed at, because a lot of these targets can be achieved, not necessarily through a lot of aid, but through a lot of political will. And then finally, I think we talked about confidence, and many countries that come on study tours in Rwanda ask us, how do you get this confidence to stand up to donors and sometimes even reject projects or reject aid as we've done in the past? And I think it really comes from your grassroots. When you know that your grassroots is believing in you and you have the support of your grassroots, as we've seen in the latest election, then you get the confidence. And we have put in place programs to actually ensure that the grassroots believes in government through, for example, I think Michelle mentioned the VUP program, which is actually direct support to the communities, and organized communities sees what are the payoffs of being organized and being organized for development.
Thank you, Campetta. And Gabriel, I don't know if you wish to respond to the Swiss ambassador's point about not just focusing on the long term, but also the short term, demobilization, disarmament, the more political aspects.
Sure. Before I do that, let me once again emphasize this issue of, the colleague from the World Bank talked about the donor coordination and so on, and praised Rwanda for doing that coordination. But honestly, if I had my way, I would encourage this august body to leave Kigali thinking about what I call the new normal: less donor dependence, more foreign direct investment into this country. Let it be said when we meet here 2-3 years from now that Campetta is busy coordinating the investors coming into Rwanda and not the aid donors. So I think it is an ambitious goal, but I think that's one we all need to look forward to. The Swiss ambassador on Burundi, we've had very robust discussion on this. Yes, we are largely focused on sort of the medium to long-term issues, focusing on infrastructure development and so on. And this is partly because the division of labor between the different partners, which at the request of the government of Burundi has placed us to focus on infrastructure, energy, roads, power, dams, and not the demobilization and reintegration. As we indicated yesterday, we've done a little bit of that, but I think more the UN types and the non-governmental bodies are more equipped to handle interventions like that. But if, as you are the chair of the Burundi, my challenge to you is that instead of squeezing the World Bank and ADB to do some more, I think you should go out there and flag Burundi as an aid orphan. I think if you talk
Let him answer. Huh? Are you going to do that?
Sure, that's my task.
Okay, very good. If you talk to Moses, my good friend Moses from South Sudan there, they spend an inordinate amount of time coordinating the donors. And, just a couple of hours from Juba is Bujumbura, and the few donors that are there are pulling out for various reasons. So if we're going to put our resources together, let's do it to get more donors and more private sector to come in.
Okay, Gabriel, thank you very much indeed.